Recording this webinar, and we will make it available in on our YouTube channel, and you will be emailed once we archive the webinar. Today we have our second Healthy Brain Initiative webinar of 2022. Today's presentation is titled Preventing Violence, Abuse, Neglect, and Exploitation of People with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. And I wanted to just give you a little bit about the presentation. The Arc National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability will share information about projects they're working on related to violence prevention, including hearing from survivors with intellectual and developmental disabilities about the urgency of addressing this topic at the national, state, and local level. Information about the range of abuse and neglect of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities experience will be discussed, including the aging population. Today we have Leanne Davis with us, James Meadors, Mark Starford, and Keisha Weller. Welcome. I will let each presenter say a little bit about themselves. Just for housekeeping purposes, Healthy Brain webinar series is presented by the HealthMatters program. We are located at the Department of Disability and Human Development at the University of Illinois at Chicago, in partnership with National Task Group on Intellectual Disabilities and Dementia Practices. We're also funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention through the Healthy Brain Initiative Award. And contents are solely the responsibility of the authors and do not represent the official views of the CDCs. As a reminder, CEUs are not offered for the webinars. Again, each live webinar will be recorded and available to view on YouTube channel, and I will post that information and you will be emailed. Please use chat box for comments and questions. I will monitor them. We will hold all the questions until 15 minutes until the end. And then that's where we're going to enter that discussion portion and question and answer portion of the presentation. All right, welcome and take it away.
Thank you so much, Yasmina, and also to Beth for inviting us to speak about a topic that is personally so important to each one of us as panel members today. And thank you all for coming and kind of sharing this space with us of talking about sexual violence. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Leanne Davis, and I'm the Senior Director for our Criminal Justice Initiatives at the Arc of the United States. I actually work from a home office in Texas, but I've been working with the Arc for 26 years, really focused on the intersection of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who come in contact with the criminal justice system, either as victims or as suspect defendants. So that has been sort of my life's work over the past number of years, and really wanting to bring the issue about sexual violence to the forefront as well. I am a survivor myself, and intuitively understood just how challenging it can be to get the support you need, just all of the different challenges that survivors face. And then coming into the field of intellectual developmental disabilities, really understanding just how high the risk is and how little that has been done to really address this issue. So excited to be here. Thank you again for being here with us. And I'm going to pass it on to James. James, you want to go next?
Sure. My name is James Meadors, and I've been involved with this project, and tell the short version of my story. I've been a long-time self-advocate leader, a long time, over 3 decades, but the last 4 years, I decided to change my priorities to focus on more about sexual assault and people who've been hurt this way, because as a person with a disability, I was sexually assaulted multiple times. And like I said, I decided to come out and share my experience and hope to help others to share their experience who've been hurting this way. And oftentimes people don't take the time to hear what happened to us. I hope you learned something today, and I hope you could be better to support this person who's gone the same thing we deal with in our own lives.
Keisha, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Leanne. Hello, everyone. My name is Keisha Weller, and I have been working with preventing violence, abuse, and neglect and exploitation of people with intellectual developmental abilities since 2012. And I'm a sub-advocacy leader on the Board Resource Center sexual assault abuse team, and I've been a disability rights advocate for the last 30 years, but since 2012 I've been working on preventing sexual violence for people with intellectual developmental disabilities, and one of the things one of the ways I do that is talk about sexual violence projects. This is a multi-year grant that we got from the Woods Foundation. The National Arc and the Board Resource Center got from the Woods Foundation is fabulous, and you're going to hear about it today. And that's about it. Mark, do you want to introduce yourself?
Of course. I'm Mark Starford, and I'm the director of the Board Resource Center, the group that Keisha's talking about. And she actually did a great job of describing us and our work for the past 30 years in supporting both children, families, and adults with developmental and other disabilities to have the freedom to live the life that they choose. And what brought me into this work in particular was in the beginning of 2011, incidents in California brought it to the attention of both Keisha, myself, and others about we needed to do something different. And over the course of the years, our focus has been not just with NCCJD, but also with other state and national agencies to increase awareness about abuse and its implications, trauma, and most recently for the past 4 years, educating and providing knowledge directly from advisors such as James and Keisha to the healthcare profession. We'll talk more about it. So thank you. Glad to be here.
Great, thank you, Keisha, James, and Mark. And I will get us started just kind of talking about who the Arc is. And many of you probably already know about the Arc, but for those of you who may be new to this organization, our mission at the Arc is to promote and protect the human rights of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, really supporting full inclusion and participation in the community throughout their lives. And to do that, we focus on policy, program, and legal advocacy. And the area that I've been working in while at the Arc has really been more on programming and figuring out how do we get tools, supports to our chapter network, as well as others around really critical issues. And of course, educating around sexual violence and violence prevention is huge. We have 600 plus chapters throughout the country. And if you don't know who your chapter is and you want to, please follow up with me and I'll be happy to connect you to a local or state chapter in your area. So more about what we call NCCJD for short. This is the National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability. And it was in 2013 that we received a grant through the Department of Justice, Bureau Justice Assistance to kind of get, I call it the chance of a lifetime, to create a center that would allow us to really put the issue of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the criminal justice system sort of on the map. Before, there really wasn't a place where you could find comprehensive kind of coverage on this issue. And we wanted to be able to bring in, where are the model programs? Where's the research? who's doing what in the country on these topics, and really have a place to hold all of that. So that was the purpose of the center. And part of that was also to create what we call the Pathways to Justice training, which I'll talk a little bit about as well. And that's important because we're not only training law enforcement, but also victim advocates around issues like sexual violence. But the center itself was created in 2013, really looking at advocating at that intersection of reforming the criminal justice system and also advancing disability rights. And we currently have a portfolio of 5 projects and other contracts that keep us very busy, happily busy to really continue spreading information, accurate information, and timely information on these topics. And we support people with intellectual and developmental disabilities directly around these issues, as well as our chapter network to lead in this work. So in terms of what the center does overall, we provide training and technical assistance. We have a number of different projects where we're working, for example, right now on one to bring in more about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities with the something similar to CIT training or crisis intervention team training. We also provide information referral so that if there's a police officer, a person with a disability, a family member who's seeking help or support, someone who's been victimized, for example, and they're not getting the help they need, they can call the center and we will do our best to connect them with the right resources and advocate for them in that way. We also provide resource collection and creation, doing different policy briefs and fact sheets on key issues, including victimization, and we educate, of course, through social media and webinars and conferences. So kind of honing in a little bit more specifically on the victimization issue, I had mentioned that we created the Pathways to Justice training, and that is a one-day training that really looks at providing key information to law enforcement, attorneys, and victim service providers around issues impacting people with disability. So this allows us to bring forth information, whether it's through fact sheets, whether it's through papers specifically on victimization, to really get to key issues that they're wanting to know more about. For example, the issue around interviewing crime victims with disabilities. We also have projects with a focus on outreach to victims, and we'll talk to you more today about one of those, which is called Talk About Sexual Violence. And also we did what's called Know Your Rights series to really provide some key information coming from people with disabilities about how they can know their rights if they're become a crime victim. So this is what I was talking about in the last slide about Pathways to Justice. This kind of gives you an overview of what the training is and does. And it involves 3 key steps. And the first one is creating what's called a disability response team. And you can see a picture of one here. This is a pilot when we did a pilot of the training in New Jersey. And it's key to not only provide a training, but to create a community around that training so that you can have sustainability around what is learned. So we thought it would be important to create a team of people who would work together to put on a training, and that team would be very inclusive. You can see here under our Pathways principles that these are our principles that we feel are very important anytime we're providing training around disability issues. And one is that we always say nothing about us without us. Everything that we do should first include people with disabilities. And in that disability response team, it is required to include people with disabilities as co-trainers as well. It also must be community-based, have many different professions at the table, and relationship-oriented as well. So through that, step 1 is creating that team, but then step 2 is putting on a one-day training, and then we provide ongoing technical assistance for that site so that they can think through what are key issues. Maybe they, for example, pick an issue around victimization, because that is the key issue that they see, where there's still a lack of accommodations, there's a lack of communication or understanding about how the issue. And so that's an example of where we can really work with communities to look at where the gaps are and hopefully provide training, but also support around specific areas. And this is just a list of some of the other work that we've been doing. And I wanted to highlight those that are bolded here, and I'll read those out. So one of them is the Healing Crime Victims with Disabilities online toolkit. And I don't know if many of you have heard of this resource yet, but this was funded through OVC, or the Office of Victims of Crime. It's a really comprehensive resource. It was a 3-year project led by the Vera Institute of Justice, and we were a partner on that project. And it really created a wonderful toolkit for all kinds of professionals who want to learn more about how to better serve crime victims with disabilities. It's also got specific information for families, for people who support crime victims with disabilities, and for people with disabilities themselves. So we will be providing links directly to this in the chat as we are able to. I can only do one thing at a time right now, but and you may have some questions about that too later, so we'll get to those as well. And then another one is called the People with Disabilities Foundation Know Your Rights series. So we held webinars last year specific to helping people with disabilities know their rights if they are victims of crime. And we worked with people with disabilities who presented on these webinars, as well as the PACER Center, who has an anti-bullying center. And so one of the issues that came out through that is the key issue of bullying, and we worked with them on that. And then lastly, one highlighted here is called the National Coalition for Sexual Health. Thank you, Yasmina. She put the link in there. The National Coalition for Sexual Health has been an amazing partner for us because they do not work within the disability world specifically, and they hadn't before. But their whole goal is to really get information out in communities about sexual health and wellness. And so we've been working with them to go alongside with what they're doing and really bring disability into that conversation, and looking at ways that we can partner in the future together. So those are some of the projects and initiatives that we've worked on. Now I want to kind of move into sort of the meat of the presentation and talk to you more about the challenges that we're seeing for people with disabilities around victimization. And I want to start with the numbers. When I first started in the field over 20 years ago, we did not have numbers for how often people with intellectual and developmental disabilities were being victimized. It was later, when some legislation was passed, the National Crime Victims Survey finally came into existence. And since that time, we have been able to track how often people with different types of disabilities experience victimization. And so we often use this data to help people understand that this is a real issue, that we have real data behind it, and that we also need to know our own data within our own communities. But here you can see on the right side of this image, it says that individuals with cognitive disabilities face the highest rates of violent victimization. So this survey looks at different types of disability, and one of those is cognitive. And they determined that those with cognitive disabilities do face the highest risk. And again, this is from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And we can also provide direct links to this data. Another finding that came out was that people with intellectual disability were 7 times more likely to experience sexual assault compared to those without disabilities. And it's important to understand the data, because as we come closer to understanding that, we get a fuller picture of just how often this can be happening to people we know. And that is really what helps fuel money, resources to help us address this problem directly. So keeping that in mind, there's also barriers to justice, though, for crime victims with disabilities. One of those is that oftentimes reports of victimization are not believed. And that is key. Something, James, I see you're shaking your head. You and I talk about this all the time in different presentations, and how important it is that we do much more training and education, because there can be stereotypes about people with disabilities. Bias, people don't understand that, yes, people can absolutely give credible testimony, and that accommodations are needed to do that. So another issue is that cases may go unprosecuted, especially if there are communication challenges, and too often services and supports for crime victims are inaccessible. I wanted to raise a note on intersectionality as well. When we're thinking about how to better serve crime victims with disabilities, one thing that should always be at the forefront of that is thinking about people, how people have multiple identities. So for example, we had looked at some data to bring this out, and one of these images shows that queer women with disabilities versus all queer women who experience domestic violence, and that those who have disabilities and are also queer women experience more, a greater rate of domestic abuse. Another example here is that men of color with disabilities versus white men with disabilities, and then how often they are arrested by age 28. So data points like this are important to bring out to really understand that, this is an issue that we're missing, looking at key factors that may play a role in creating a greater risk for someone. And what we often say is we think about how are we reaching the person least likely to get help and support. Let's think about that person and work backwards and think, what's missing? What are the accommodations? Where's that person needing support? And where are they not being believed or heard? And how are we opening places in the community, circles, safe circles, where they can share, what's going on in their lives and possible different types of abuse and violence that they're facing. So this is always an important note to keep in mind, and I would really encourage you to, as you speak about this topic, as you talk to others about sexual violence, to always keep in mind the key piece on intersectionality. And in terms of types of violence that people may experience, violence can take many forms. And I listed a few here, including neglect, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, and also I had mentioned bullying and cyberbullying as well. And I gave one example of a story of 31-year-old Carl DeBrody, who had disappeared from his independent supported living home back in April of 2017. And it was days later that they actually found his body in concrete at a Fulton storage unit where he lived. So these kinds of stories that just actually kind of take our breath away and make us think, why do we not hear more about this? Or why do we not know more about this? Or why are our communities not informed? And, often I know over the years, one of the concerns that we had just around media and how much attention, that this issue gets, we may even use different terminology like abuse rather than saying rape, to really bring forth that, we need to use actual terminology that describes what's going on to people with disabilities. And Carl, his story is so powerful to show how does this happen? What steps were taken to help him have the tools that he needed? What steps are taken in the community to understand how to build in the level of safety that is needed, but also empowering people to make decisions as well around their safety. And I know something that James and I have talked about too is even we have to balance, that the the dignity of risk of people, balancing risk with autonomy, and understanding how to do that within our families, within communities. So just keeping that in mind as we think about violence and the different types of violence and abuse that people with disabilities face. And when we think about the different types of disabilities and populations as well, I wanted to just provide this picture that kind of looks at the different types of disabilities and how there's so many different diversity, so much diversity within disability. And some of the key issues that we'll talk about today around how we're looking at providing solutions around helping people who experience different types of violence. These can be tips and ideas that can be used for people with all types of disability. So here we look at the top, just the different types of physical disabilities are at the top of the image here. That speaks to blind or low vision, for example, or heart disease. But then at the bottom here, we look at the brain-based types of disabilities, which could include mental health disability or mental illness, as well as developmental disability. And within that bucket, we have intellectual disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, and then fetal alcohol spectrum disorder as examples. But I wanted to point out too that people can also have dual diagnosis. And that's important to keep in mind as we think about different types of supports or also how people are being identified or not identified as needing accommodations as victims of crime. And we added to the traumatic brain injury as well and cerebral palsy. And we'll also be talking about the aging population too, and how we need to be familiar with the different types of supports and services they need. So that leads me to this slide around challenges for people who either have intellectual developmental disabilities, traumatic brain injury, or are from the aging community, and how we need to be addressing violence for all of these areas. So one of the things that we know is that victim service providers don't necessarily know about the issue, understand how critical it is, or how to connect to disability organizations. So that's a big piece of what we're trying to do through Pathways to Justice training and in other areas is figuring out how to break the silos between these different organizations, agencies who often don't talk to each other, and how can we find common ground in really seeing, what brought people to that work, what is important about that work, and how can we share in those values and that motivation to really ensure that people are getting the support they need. Another issue is around just different cultures and different terminology that we use. People who are more from a disability background, they have different words and terminology than, say, someone from the anti-violence movement or sexual assault organizations. So learning how we can use similar language or learn each other's language and culture in our own work environments and in our own, wherever we do advocacy is really important too. We often see there's just a lack of opportunity to work together, co-train and learn from each other. So really building that in and being very proactive about doing that, reaching out, even when, we don't necessarily have a contact person there, and always thinking about how to work hand in hand with people with disabilities in any effort that we make to do that. And then something that I've definitely noticed over the years is the challenge of not having the funding there. I'm sure that all of you probably may have experienced this at some level, that you get funding for 6 months, a year, 2 years if you're lucky, and then the funding goes. And so we have to think really long-term and strategic about how do we create, support programs, movements that move beyond a time-limited small bit of funding, and how do we really create something sustainable? I wanted to just bring up some numbers around elder abuse research too, since I also mentioned some research in the disability community. So one analysis study found that 1 in 6 elders in the community experienced some form of abuse in the past year. And then a more recent study on abuse, specifically looking at older women, found that 1 in 6 had experienced abuse in the prior year as well. Now, when we look at institutions specifically, there were fewer studies, but those also found high levels of abuse. And here it lists the different types of abuse that people had experienced in institutions. Psychological abuse was around 33%, physical abuse 14%, financial 13%, neglect 11%, and sexual abuse 1%. And I do have the source data there on the slide, but I want to mention that, you know, data is only as good as our ability to access the data and to get data from people. So as you know, many times it's hard to find data like this to get to the truth of what's actually happening in our society, because it can be very difficult for people to come forward. There could be a lot of reasons why people are afraid to do that. We know that quite a bit of abuse, whether it's elder abuse or within the disability community, can happen in family settings where there's you know, many barriers for people to feel like they can come forward or report. So even though we do have data around some data points around this, it's important to keep in mind that there is still limitations around that as well. So I wanted to just kind of take a minute to look at how violence is kind of, what are the similarities that we see within the disability population and the aging community when it comes to violence of different forms. So I think both of these, both populations face unique challenges throughout the criminal justice system. That includes coming into the system, maybe not being, like I said before, not being understood, not being believed. It can be difficult even to get services at the local rape crisis center, who may say they don't serve that population. And then you try to find that in the disability services, and they say, well, we don't know how to do that exactly. So that can happen for both people with disabilities and those in the aging community. And this really creates a unique opportunity for us to think about how we can work together and looking at what are some of the similarities to consider there. Also remembering that one size does not fit all. So knowing one person with a disability means you only know one person. And when we're thinking about providing support or accommodations, the best thing to do is ask the person, you know, ask them what they need. And that includes whether someone's in the disability community or within the aging population. And to remember that disability is a human rights issue, just like race, gender identity, and religion. And you know, when it comes to aging issues, people with disabilities, often as you age, you can become a person with a disability as well. It's really on a continuum, and we all have a better chance at understanding issues around violence when we work together closely and think about how we can provide better supports. So just for some considerations for victims, to remember that there is a heightened risk and a lack of education about that risk overall. We've also talked about within our project that I'm about to hand over to the team to talk about, that there's some concerns around the decision to report. And with issues of mandatory reporting, how are we supporting people with disabilities to make decisions around that, and using supported decision making and other tools to help them with that. Also, how professionals receive reports. We had already talked about credibility issues, medical treatment or medical support, what is actually available or accessible. Thinking about access to advocates, so peer advocates and other advocates that can help along the healing journey, and the lack of inclusive and accessible crime victim or healing services. So ensuring that whatever services are available to the general population, that same level of access is provided to people with disabilities. So with that kind of overview of the issue of people with disabilities and experiencing violence, I wanted to hand it over to Mark, who is going to talk a little bit more in depth about the Talk About Sexual Violence project that the four of us are working on together.
Thank you. To begin with, just as the slide talks about and shows you James and Keisha, they are national leaders. They are people who have come forward. They are survivors. They're self-advocate survivors themselves and openly telling their story nationally and are well known for their compassion and the passion. And with the leadership of James and Keisha, and I really want to emphasize that what makes talk about sexual violence a little unique is that they and other self-advocate leaders that they'll be talking about are leading the way. Leanne and I are in the background as their facilitators, working with them as well as with healthcare providers to find out what could be improved. But I think, when I look, there's something I could really add to the importance of this other than to emphasize what James and Keisha both are saying right here is that number one, the most primary element is that all people deserve a life free from abuse. And while we all acknowledge that, it is now moving, and as Keisha says, then taking that out of the shadows, taking it out of we don't discuss it, whether it be in families, care providers, or in doctors' offices, that everybody has this right, and then is the strategy on how to support those that have been traumatized, whether as a child or an adult, into healing. So at that point, I want to stop and introduce Keisha, who comes along with the next slide. Next slide. Oh, it's James. Sorry about that. Sorry, it was my error. James and Leanne for that slide.
The reason, oh, do you want me to go start? Okay.
Yeah, you can take over, James. Yeah.
Sure. One of the things when me and Leanne was figure out how we could spread this message because it's an important issue, and we have tried to been educate Joe. Some of you guys may know Joe Shapiro, NPR, and he's the same person that did the book called No Pity. And one of the things we try to educate him about is that oftentimes people get abused, betrayed by being harmed by sexual assault because not many groups were not open to talk about it like a taboo. And one of the things was very interested when he did the story is 7 times more than typical people without disabilities. I'm sorry, people without disabilities, because as me and Keisha share our story, because the rates are higher up for us without our peers without disabilities, because some of us may afraid or feel intimidated or even felt like no one would believe them. And why I decided 4 years ago to focus on this issue because of that reason, the silence of the voices who need to be heard about this issue, because oftentimes people not hear from us and hear our perspective about why it's important to support people with IDD and developmental disabilities to talk about it, because we need to have an understanding how the left hand is talking to the right hand, because we need to support one another who've been harmed this way. Next slide, Leanne. Oh, that's one of the neat opportunities I had to do was Leanne Davis and myself. Leanne was there to support me. We did a 1 in 6 video. And that was the first time that I recognized a male who was a person with an intellectual disability to share his story and his experience. But one of the neat things about the 1 in 6 video, when you watch it, it's not just a one person sharing their story. They have multiple guys who are young adults age, even a person who is in the military who is much older than me to talk about sexual assault issues because it happened to them. And it's just a unique perspective of people sharing their stories and how they could overcome the trauma of sexual assault. And this video is, I know we don't have time to show it, but if you want to look it up on YouTube, you could watch it. And we have over 4 million views as last year, but I know the number is much more now because a lot of people are starting to discuss about this, especially men, because as a male survivor, not a lot of males do not talk about their experience who've been hurt by sexual assault, like I did in my early assaults. But until 2005, I shared my last assault. But I did not realize 4 years from now, 4 years ago to today, I never imagined myself being a leader of this movement. And now it's the next slide. Oh. And Keisha is talking about the Sexual Violence Project.
Thank you, James. I really appreciate the introduction. The goal, Mark, will you want to take this? Okay, the goal of talking about sexual violence is to help educate medical providers and their patients with disabilities have meaningful conversations about sexual abuse. Medical providers have a unique and important opportunity to address sexual abuse with patients, but often do not have the background or access to the right resources. The purpose of the conversation videos is to demonstrate via role-playing to medical providers on the proper way of communicating to sexual violence patients by using supportive decision making. I think that the conversation videos are important because they demonstrate how to do supportive decision making works to medical providers. The medical providers, by using supportive decision making, to help what they need as a person who has experienced sexual violence. I think that supportive decision making is very important to have in any type of setting for the sexual violence survivor. Next slide.
So if I could just jump in here a little bit, Keisha, and talk about sexual violence is now in its third phase, meaning that we initially were funded in 2017 by the WITH Foundation, and we currently are. This phase, which is the third, is a 3-year phase. The first one was to bring forward and illustrate some of the barriers that Keisha's talking about, especially women with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and some of the difficulties in having appointments with medical providers. And during that first year, tools were made both for self-advocate survivors, care providers, and medical providers. The second year, in the second phase, highlighted James and illustrating the same crisis that happens when men with intellectual and developmental disabilities actually meet with their physicians, nurses, or even share with care providers about the lack of believability that James spoke about. So, and now we're in our third phase, which is the outreach phase. And our goal during this phase was to, and is, to interview and conduct focus groups with medical providers across the country to determine what are some of the barriers they're confronting in creating this rapport and the relationship that's needed for the patient with developmental disabilities who is a survivor and a victim at that point to get the support and recovery they need, and to create the bridge between the disability community, the healthcare community, and the self-advocate community. The last component and the most important aspect of this third phase is Keisha and James leading a national to um, to support advocacy groups, self-advocacy and peer advocacy groups nationwide to begin the conversation so for people to open up to where they feel freer in speaking with those that they trust, especially in the medical field. So that is a very, very brief overview of our efforts. And we also have a website that is being revitalized with new materials by the same name. Keisha.
Yes, Stronger Together is a national movement to develop a vision and plan to address sexual violence against persons with a disability. Stronger Together is a collaboration between persons with disabilities who are also survivors of sexual violence and partner organizations from around the country. Stronger Together represents the vision of inclusive, collaborative, and inter-organizational action to address sexual violence against persons with disability on a national scale. Stronger Together was created in 2019 through support from the Massachusetts-based Building Partnership in the Protection of Persons with Disabilities Initiative. Leading partners are Building Partner Initiative, Massachusetts Disabled Persons Protection Commission, and the Blood Research Center. The Stronger Together missions is to address sexual violence against persons with disabilities on a national scale through active collaboration between persons with disabilities who are also survivors of sexual violence, federal and state agencies, and other partner organizations. Stronger Together values. Stronger Together is built on a set of core values. These values are essential of who we are and guide our priorities and decisions and actions. Inclusivity. We are people of different abilities, identities, and backgrounds, and ideas. Respect. Every person deserves respect. Freedom from sexual violence. Every person has the right to be free from sexual violence. Collaboration. We achieve more when we work together. Next steps. We are breaking out of the disability bubble and partner with victim advocates and agencies whenever possible. We support self-advocate leaders in the movement to end all forms of violence. Sexual advocates support leaders are in the forefront of ending violence in all forms because they have experienced sexual violence firsthand and can help other self-advocate sexual violence heal from their own sexual violence experiences. Sexual assault survivors leaders can train APS, Adult Protective Services social workers, to have a humanitarian approach towards APS interviewing and investigations. Next slide. Think about your own journey and the champions of justice who inspire you. Support research, policy, and programs that seek to make lasting change. Build strong collaborations with partners at the community and national and international level. Stay informed to be proactive.
Thank you, Keisha.
Bye.
So this is our team, and this is what we've been working on. And I did want to just go back And see, James, if you had anything, I think you mentioned that you wanted to share a little bit on the collaboration piece as well.
Yes, the collaboration piece is important because we need to hear from everyone who are self-advocates, but also the unique perspective I have. I know I'm a person who's a survivor, but also sometimes we need to think outside the box. Like I was saying, nurses who are sexual assault nurse examiners. And one of the projects me and Leon's working on is that one of the projects is that it's one of my former seniors who helped me, and she's decided to be a part of it because she wanted to help to make the community better for all people, not just people with disabilities, but all people who've been hurt sexual assault. But also, when you talk about self-advocates, you all assume do you need a survivor to be at the table, but also you include other self-advocates who not been hurt this way, who have a passion, want to prevent sexual assault to another person. Because my perspective is different from a person in Arkansas. Her name is Julie. She never experienced like I experienced, but we need corporations, groups like that, and find other people who are very passionate on this issue, who not experienced, but have the passion of the heart to change things, change the attitude, change how we can make it better for all people. Because the bottom line is sexual assault, it's no choice of people that get chosen to be sexual assault, but instead we need to support all people, no matter if they're a person with a disability or a person without disability, because that's important. Because one of the neat things I learned when I came out 4 years ago, I did not know about Keisha's experience because I didn't have no path to follow, a map to guide myself to do what I'm doing today. And one of my favorite actors of all time is Sidney Poitier. And several years ago, several decades ago, when he got the honorary Oscar, he was talking his experience as an African American actor. He didn't have no one to follow his follow to be an actor. It's like me too, as a survivor, as a male survivor. I didn't have a guide to follow. I learned at the same time I guide myself. I hope the stuff I learned to help another male or another female to guide their way to be like national leaders like myself and Keisha. That's the most important thing is we never cause judgment. We should support them. When they have good days, we support them. Even when they have bad days, we should support them. Even when they're in the middle halfway, we should support them. All those 3 steps.
Thank you, James. And I think that just ends it perfectly with the saying that we have on the slide too, is that we are all in this together. And to look for ways to break out of silos, to work both within the disability community, but also outside of the disability community, and how we can make this movement stronger. So that is the end of our presentation. I think we're ready for questions. So Yasmina, I think think you're overseeing that piece for us.
Yes, thank you so much, Leanne, James, Keisha, and Mark. I'm going to hold off on all of the comments because we're having a lot of questions, so I'm going to just get into them. First question is, do any of the ARC's projects address the unique needs of interviewing and supporting people who have significant difficulty speaking and/or who use augmentative communication methods? I will put it in the chat box as well so everyone can see it.
Yeah, that is a great question. And thank you to whoever raised that, Patricia. Great question. And we don't have a project that specifically looks at that area, but we do bring that topic into training that we already do. So for example, with the Pathways to Justice training, we would definitely speak about people that need more support for example, communicating, different types of alternative technology that's available. But I do think that this is an issue that we definitely have not done enough work in. And when I say we, I mean the whole disability community, and thinking about how do we reach this population specifically. And there's two different organizations or agencies that I've talked to pretty extensively about this, and that is one called Communication First, which is I don't know how long they've been around now, but an organization that started that looks just at the issue of people that have limited communication or that communicate differently, and their whole focus of everything they do is around that one issue. And so, you know, we talked to them about how do we really bring the issue of violence prevention to the work that they do. So that's one potential collaboration there. And then another one is Temple University, Beverly, France, who's done a lot of work in this area over the years. I know that they have had some projects focused on this specifically. So if that's something, you know, that you want more information on, I'd love to connect you with those individuals, just so that you can get more on that. And that is something that, you know, we would like to do more of too. So thank you for raising it.
Leanne, can you repeat that organization that you just mentioned about working with survivors with limited communication?
Communication First.
I'll try to find a link for it.
Yeah, I think it should come up pretty easily. I think it's communication, then capital F first, and it may be all one word.
Oh, thank you. Rachel just posted. I will post it too. I'm trying to keep up because we're getting a lot of questions. The second question, here's the link to the Communications First. The second question, are there any new trends or breakthroughs in equipping victim advocates to serve survivors with disabilities? This seems like a key area.
So, in terms of trends, I mean, I think one of the things that we talked about today was peer support. That's the trend I'm seeing, that, wow, like there's a lot of power in that. So I guess I would hand that over to Keisha or Mark. You've both been working in that area of peer support. Do you want to talk a little bit about why peer support is so important?
I'll go for it. I am the national one of the national chairs of the peer support network, and it's peer support is very important because especially with a victim of sexual violence, going into a APS interview and being interviewed by the police department and other law enforcement officials and victim activists, it's important for a peer to be there that's actually been through the experience that the fresh sexual assault survivor has not been involved with. And so the peer support leader can help the sexual assault survivor with ways of grounding themselves, of how to go through the APS interview, the law enforcement interviews with support, because peer support is so essential nowadays. I can't speak highly of it. Mark, do you want to say something?
So behind the peer support network that Keisha's talking about is Building Partnerships Initiative, which is based in Massachusetts. They have a very well-developed peer support network that actually is a model for the country, where peer navigators are supporting self-advocates who come forward as victims and provide training. They provide one-on-one support, anti-anxiety types of activities, and they've also published easy read, easy English material for self-advocates. And again, that's being led by Building Partnerships Initiative. And it looks, yes, and their website is right up here. To contact them and to look for more information, Keisha also addressed Stronger Together. It also is a name on the top. If you click down, you'll read more about that. And again, there's a 5-year project to develop this national network and actually make it community-based that Keisha is a co-chair of.
And one of the neat things about me and Leanne, I hope I could say it. One of the neat things about me and Leanne's relationship, whenever we get an opportunity to speak, we always stress the different groups wherever we speak to the states. And I think New Jersey is my adopted home state, but mostly I was raised in the South, but mostly like New Jersey and Missouri see the true partnership of me and Leanne presenting together. And you said we want both of you guys to talk about this issue because it's not just Leanne's doing the talking, and also I share my perspective. And it's like give and take partnership. It's like 50-50 partnership. Is Leanne's not above me or look down. We are even and look each other as equals. And that's one of the neat things we present in Missouri and even New Jersey, because they value us as two professionals who are talking about this sensitive issue. And I think it's great because now the state of Arizona, as Leanne and myself do something like this again, because other states starting to talk about it and they want to replicate what other states been doing in the local and state thing. It's pretty powerful, I think.
And before we finish with this, Leanne, can you mention the 4-part webinar series that is sponsored by NAPSA and NCCJD?
Sure. Yeah, and oh gosh, we should have put that in here.
We
But
can blast it to everyone, so
Okay.
that's fine. We can put it on YouTube channel and we can
Great.
send it through our listserv as well.
Yeah, there is
It's an important-
we've been involved with wanting to bring forward a conversation coming from NAPSA and the disability community as well, about understanding how we can work better together within adult protective services. Mostly the focus has been on serving the aging community, and we want to bring more disability focus into those conversations as well. And so this webinar series is giving us a chance to kind of look at the history of how APS developed, understand kind of maybe the politics of all that, understanding what we can do differently moving forward to really partner more kind of honestly, and getting better services to people with disabilities through the adult protective service system. So that will be a great webinar that we can share more information about.
Thank you. We are 3 minutes over our time. If the presenters have a moment to hang out and answer a few more questions, and if participants are interested, we are recording this, so we will make the recording available even if some people have to leave. The PowerPoints will be shared, all the websites and all the resources will be shared, and you will be emailed once we put that up. And again, I feel like we really need a series of these informational webinars, so I'll be talking to you for further to really build this kind of awareness, because obviously the need and interest is great. The next question that we had is, can we get more information on the Know Your Rights? Interested in materials that are tailored for people with intellectual disabilities?
Yes.
Do you have the link?
Well, it's embedded in the ARC's website, so I can provide direct links to where to find those materials. I can go look for that right now as you do the next question.
Okay. You mentioned medical providers being key in this process. Can you talk a little bit more about how medical providers and healthcare organizations can help with this initiative?
I think one of the things is important whenever you see a medical doctor or a nurse, you know how we visit a doctor and usually it's like 5 or 10 minute visit. And oftentimes we don't have an opportunity to train other doctors, because one of the biggest barriers I noticed, probably Leanne, Mark, and Keisha could add, is that is opportunity to learn new things. And usually they're in a hurry to go back to help their patient, to help the person they're helping. And one of the biggest barriers I noticed is that it's the lack of training of the new training out there because they're so used to the old training. And sometimes the doctors don't really have time to learn the latest new stuff out there. And usually when someone talk about sexual
Did we lose James?
You
I
Looks
think,
like we lost James.
yeah, I think his internet. Mark, do you want to pick up on that?
you know, James really touches medical providers. Are you there, James,
yes.
to continue? Okay, go ahead.
Oh, because one of the things is the lack of training for the medical professionals sometimes don't know how to help someone who's been hurt by sexual assault. Like for a couple of years ago, I did an experiment with my own medical doctor, and my own medical doctor did not know what the steps what she needs to do to report an incident of sexual assault to another person. And that's very troubling. When I told Mark, Keisha, and Leanne about it, I said, that's wrong. We need to find a way to train medical professionals to know what steps they need to do and help them to navigate that system and to help that person who's been hurt. Because that's one of the missing gaps is we need to train the doctors how to support someone who's been hurt this way because sometimes it's very traumatic and hurtful for the survivor, and that's the only person they felt they could talk to. We need to train more doctors how to support someone who's been hurting that way, and also the nurses who are working with that doctor also.
So we learned.
Oh, go ahead. Oh,
No, I was just, I wanted to, you know, go on what James saying. During the first phase and the second phase, in talking to people in the medical field, we learned, as James has said, they didn't understand or know about the reporting requirements that they had. And that was number one. Number two, had lack of training, as James said. The consensus that the last time they heard about this was in medical school. And we also, through a focus group this year, learned quite a bit. And the results of the focus group were on the website, talkaboutSexualViolence.org, and both the report as well as a video. And it became quite alarming because they really are a key player, that if someone does go to the emergency room, an individual who has been victimized doesn't feel that they can trust a care provider or family member, and they go to a doctor and they're not, or the nurse isn't certain about how to address. And James brought up something which is paramount, is the believability when you're talking to your doctor. Do they really believe me? Or are they listening to my disability first, which Patty Cantero from BPI in Massachusetts constantly says. They see my disability, they don't hear me, they don't see me. So the work of this project is to try to slowly but surely, with coalitions nationally and with people as Keisha and James and others coming forward, to be the voice. And as James and Keisha have been saying, is that we are believable. And they can be the ones to provide guidance and facilitation to the medical profession, opposed to people such as Leanne and myself. So that's it for me. So,
thank you. Beth, you've been texting me. Did you want to make a comment? Just unmute yourself so it's not coming through me.
Which comment? I've had so many.
Well,
This
just
was,
you
this
you
was
can
a wonderful presentation. I can't thank you all enough. Go ahead, Yasmina.
we are at the 10 minutes after, so I will do a hard stop now out of respect to everyone's time. Thank you very much. I think I really hope that we can continue to talk about and really think about some additional collaboration to build this type awareness towards sexual violence and abuse and neglect. So we will be talking soon. I also have additional comments and additional attendees who would like to connect with you. So I will relay that offline too. Thank you so much again. Thank you. Have a great rest of the day. This was immensely important and helpful. We're getting a lot of thank yous. I hope you can see them in the.
Thank you.
I've tried to relay some to all the panelists, so.
There was quite a few for Keisha and James, so I just want to add to that as well. Thank you so much to
Yes.
James and Keisha for being like the key driver in all of this, and it's incredibly important work, and we are indebted to you.
And April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. I just want to let you guys know that April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and you could check out the local rape crisis center in your local community, because that's another way you could help and build a coalition together, because April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. I just want to share that.
Thank you.
And one last thing from me, nothing matters without us. Always include the self-advocates and your team and your and the sexual assault survivors and your team. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day and evening.
Yes, thank you too.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.